Fluorescent lights overhead hummed a specific grating, B-flat, vibrating against the acoustic ceiling tiles of courtroom 302. Clara pressed the pad of her index finger against the edge of the heavy oak defense table, tracing a deep scratch left by someone else's ruined life. The wood was cold lacquered, thick enough to feel like plastic. The air in the room tasted stale, heavily filtered, smelling faintly of industrial pine cleaner old paper, and the bitter burnt dregs of the coffee sitting in a paper cup near her lawyer's elbow. Clara shifted in her chair. The wool of her charcoal skirt was just slightly too heavy for the fluctuating temperature of the courthouse, prickling the back of her thighs. She wasn't terrified. She wasn't vibrating with a righteous cinematic fury. She was mostly just exhausted, nursing a dull, throbbing headache right behind her left eye, and acutely aware that her right shoe was pinching her pinky toe. "He's late," Miriam said. Clara's attorney didn't look up from her legal pad. Miriam was a woman carved from flint, wearing a navy pantsuit that probably cost more than Clara's first car. She wrote with a heavy, expensive fountain pen, the scratch of the nib against the thick yellow paper, loud in the near-empty room. "He's always late," Clara replied, her voice sounding raspy, unused. "It's part of the presentation. He thinks making a judge wait makes him look important." Miriam finally stopped writing. She capped the pen with a sharp click. "Judge Harrison is 6 months away from a pension and deals exclusively in high-net-worth divorces. He doesn't care about importance. He cares about efficiency. Richard is just annoying him." Clara swallowed her throat dry. She reached for her water bottle, but her hand was shaking a fine, irritating tremor she couldn't quite control. It pissed her off. She didn't want to be shaking. She didn't feel intimidated, yet her body was betraying her dumping adrenaline into her bloodstream for a fight she had already rigged. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a pneumatic hiss, followed by a loud echoing thud as they hit the rubber stoppers. Richard walked in. He didn't just enter a room, he occupied it, pushing the air out of the way. He was wearing a bespoke slate gray suit that hugged his broad shoulders perfectly, his silver hair swept back with just enough product to look effortless. He smelled of bergamot and expensive vetiver, a scent that used to mean safety, used to mean home, and now just smelled like a high-end department store on Christmas Eve. Cloying, overpowering. But it wasn't Richard that made Clara's stomach turn over acid rising in her throat. It was the woman clinging to his left bicep. Chloe. Clara had seen photos, of course. Private investigators charged a premium for high-resolution tragedy. But seeing her in the flesh, breathing the same recycled courthouse air, was violently different. Chloe was young, 24, maybe 25. She was wearing a cream-colored silk dress that was aggressively inappropriate for a Tuesday morning divorce hearing, paired with red-soled heels that clicked sharply against the linoleum. Clara didn't feel a sudden urge to weep. She didn't want to scream. Looking at the girl, Clara felt a bizarre, cynical detachment mixed with a heavy wave of secondhand embarrassment. Chloe was chewing the inside of her cheek, her eyes darting around the austere room, clearly out of her depth. She was wearing too much perfume, something aggressively floral jasmine and tuberose cutting straight through the smell of Richard's cologne and the room's pine cleaner. Richard caught Clara's eye. He didn't look away guiltily. He didn't offer a look of pity. He smirked. It was a subtle thing, a slight pull at the corner of his mouth, a tightening of his jaw that communicated a terrifying level of confidence. He leaned over, whispering something into Chloe's ear. The girl let out a breathless, high-pitched giggle that died instantly in the heavy acoustics of the courtroom. "Look at him," Clara muttered the words, tasting like copper. He actually brought her. Let him, Miriam said, her voice dropping to a low, soothing monotone. Arrogance makes people sloppy. Juries care about mistresses. Judges in equitable distribution states do not. The judge will see a man wasting the court's time with a dog and pony show. Keep your eyes on the table, Clara. Don't give him the reaction. Clara forced her gaze down to the yellow legal pad in front of her. Her own handwriting stared back at her, a messy list of account numbers and dates. She remembered the day she had found out about Chloe. It wasn't a lipstick stain or a late-night text. It was an anomaly in the corporate ledger for Horizon Global, a recurring expense categorized vaguely as consulting creative that was being routed to an LLC registered in Delaware. Clara had built the company's accounting architecture from the ground up 15 years ago on a bulky desktop computer in a damp garage. Richard was the salesman. He shook hands, played golf, and talked loudly. Clara was the architect. She understood the plumbing of their empire. When she traced the LLC back to a luxury apartment lease under Chloe's name, Clara hadn't confronted him. She hadn't thrown plates or cried on the bathroom floor. She had felt a cold physical snap in the center of her chest, like a dry branch breaking. And then she had gone to work. Richard and Chloe settled into the chairs at the plaintiff's table. Richard's lawyer, a large red-faced man named Brent, was already there, sweating profusely despite the air conditioning. Brent leaned over, clapping Richard on the shoulder, laughing at something Richard said. A sharp buzzer sounded cutting through the low murmur of voices. The bailiff, an older woman with tired eyes, stood up. All rise. Court is in session. The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. Clara stood, her knees popping softly. She smoothed the front of her skirt. The wood of the table bit into her palms as she leaned heavily against it. Across the aisle, Richard stood tall, chest puffed out, looking less like a man facing the dissolution of a 20-year marriage and more like a CEO waiting to ring the opening bell at the stock exchange. He still thought this was a negotiation. He still thought he held all the cards. He had no idea the table was entirely missing legs. Judge Harrison entered from a side door, his black robe billowing slightly behind him. He looked exactly as Miriam had described, tired nearing retirement and thoroughly unimpressed with the world. He had a shock of white hair and a deeply lined face. He carried a massive stack of manila folders, dropping them onto the elevated bench with a heavy, unceremonious thud that made Chloe jump in her seat. "Be seated," Judge Harrison mumbled, not looking at anyone. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, hooked them over his ears, and began opening the top file. He sighed. It was a long, rattling sound that carried through the microphone on his desk. Case number 44-09-B, Dissolution of Marriage, Richard versus Clara. He peered over the rim of his glasses. Counsel, we are here today to finalize the division of assets. I have reviewed the preliminary filings. Mr. Brent, I see you've submitted a rather extensive addendum regarding the Horizon Global holdings. Brent shot up from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket over his strained stomach. Yes, Your Honor. My client is prepared to offer a very generous settlement. However, as the sole founder, CEO, and managing director of Horizon Global, Mr. Richard must retain full operational control and 100% of the voting shares. The company's current market valuation is a direct result of his singular vision and executive leadership. Clara dug her fingernails into her own palms. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it physically hurt. Singular vision. She looked at Richard. He was nodding along with his lawyer, looking gravely serious, as if absorbing a great compliment. Beside him, Chloe was staring blankly at the judge, clearly bored, subtly checking her reflection in the dark screen of her phone resting on her lap. "Your Honor." Brent continued his voice, taking on a booming theatrical quality that belonged in a television drama, not a Tuesday morning asset hearing. "When my client started this business, it was nothing but an idea. Over 20 years he has bled for this company. He has traveled 300 days a year. He has secured the international contracts. The defense's request for 50% of the corporate equity is not only laughable, it would destabilize the entire corporate structure and jeopardize the livelihoods of 400 employees." Miriam sat perfectly still next to Clara. She didn't object. She didn't scoff. She just let the silence stretch out after Brent finished his grandstanding. "I see," Judge Harrison said dryly. He flipped a page. "And the proposed settlement for the wife," Brent puffed out his chest. "We are prepared to offer the primary residence in full. The mortgage is fully paid along with a lump sum of $2.5 million paid out in quarterly installments over 5 years. Furthermore, Mr. Richard will assume all marital debt accrued on the joint credit accounts." $2.5 million. The company had cleared $40 million in profit last quarter alone. Clara felt a sudden bizarre urge to laugh. It bubbled up in her chest, sharp and hysterical. She pressed her lips together so hard they went numb. This was how little he thought of her. After 20 years of ironing his shirts, balancing his chaotic ledgers, catching his mistakes before they bankrupted them, and silently building the infrastructure that allowed him to stand on stages and play the visionary genius. This was the price tag he put on her silence. A house that felt like a tomb and an allowance. She remembered the night Horizon Global actually began. It wasn't in a boardroom. It was in a bleak neon-lit diner off Interstate 95 at 2 a.m. Richard had just been fired from a mid-level sales job for fighting with a vendor. He was drunk on cheap beer and self-pity, crying into a plate of cold fries, talking about ending it all. Clara, exhausted from working a double shift at the hospital, had pulled a napkin toward her. She had drawn the supply chain model right there stained with ketchup. She explained how they could undercut his former employer. She had taken the $20,000 her grandmother left her, the money meant for a down payment on a decent house, and used it to file the LLC, rent a server, and buy inventory. Richard was the mouthpiece. He was fantastic at it. He could charm the money out of a stone, but Clara was the brain. She drafted the contracts. She set up the holding companies. She navigated the complex tax codes that allowed them to scale internationally. She did it all quietly from the spare bedroom, letting him have the titles and the magazine covers because she loved him, and because his ego was a fragile, dangerous thing that needed constant feeding. Until Chloe. "Ms. Miriam," Judge Harrison said, turning his tired eyes to their table. "Your client rejects this offer." Miriam stood up slowly. She smoothed her jacket. The contrast between her and the sweating, blustering Brent was stark. "We do, Your Honor. The offer is not only inequitable, it is fundamentally based on a misrepresentation of fact." Brent scoffed loudly, leaning into his microphone. "Your Honor, the defense is delusional. We have provided tax returns, W-2s, and press clippings demonstrating my client's role as the sole architect of Horizon Global." "Press clippings," Miriam repeated softly, letting the absurdity of the phrase hang in the air. She picked up a thick leather-bound binder from the table. It was heavy-packed with hundreds of pages of documents. "Your Honor, my client does not want 50% of Horizon Global." Richard shifted in his seat. He leaned toward Brent, a smug, victorious smile creeping across his face. He whispered loudly enough for Clara to hear. "She's caving. She doesn't have the stomach for a fight." Clara didn't look at him. She watched the judge. She watched the way the fluorescent light caught the dust motes dancing over the judge's bench. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed very loud. Her heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Thud, thud, thud. "She doesn't want 50%, Judge Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is she asking for a larger lump sum in lieu of equity?" "No, Your Honor," Miriam said. She walked out from behind the defense table, carrying the heavy binder toward the bench. Her heels clicked softly on the floor. "My client is not asking for any equity in Horizon Global." A collective breath seemed to leave the plaintiff's side of the room. Brent visibly relaxed, sinking back into his squeaky leather chair. Chloe looked up from her phone, sensing the shift in tension, and gave Richard a bright, vacant smile. Richard actually let out a short, breathy laugh of relief. He looked over at Clara, his eyes filled with a patronizing pity. He mouthed the words, "Thank you." Clara felt the acid in her stomach churn. The sheer stupidity of his confidence was staggering. He had never read the paperwork. In 20 years, he had signed hundreds, thousands of documents she had placed on his desk, and he had never once read the fine print. He just signed where the yellow sticky note told him to sign. Miriam handed the binder to the bailiff, who carried it up to the judge. "My client is not asking for equity," Miriam repeated, turning slowly to face Richard. Her voice dropped, becoming razor sharp, cutting through the stale air of the courtroom. "Because my client cannot ask for something she already owns in its entirety." The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute heavy and suddenly very cold. It was the kind of silence that follows a car crash right before the screaming starts. At the plaintiff's table, Brent froze halfway through unscrewing the cap of a plastic water bottle. The plastic cracked loudly in his grip. Richard's smug smile didn't vanish instantly. It sort of melted, freezing into an expression of confused, dull-witted irritation. He looked like a man who had just been told a joke in a language he didn't speak. "Objection," Brent stammered out, pushing himself up from his chair. "Your Honor, what is this? Is this a stunt? My client is the CEO and founder of Horizon Global. His name is on the building." "His name is on the lease of the building council." Miriam corrected her tone, remarkably conversational, as if pointing out a typo. "A lease paid by the parent company." Judge Harrison ignored them both. He flipped open the heavy leather binder. The sound of the thick, archival quality paper turning was the only noise in the room. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the top document. Clara watched the deep wrinkles on his forehead shift. Counselor Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its tired drone, and taking on a sharp, dangerous edge. "Explain Exhibit A." "Gladly, Your Honor," Miriam said, stepping back to the defense table and opening her own copy of the binder. Horizon Global is a subsidiary. It has always been a subsidiary. It is fully owned and operated under a holding corporation known as Vanguard Capital Management. Richard scoffed, but it sounded wet nervous. "Vanguard is just a shell for tax purposes. It's my shell." Miriam didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes locked on the judge. "If Your Honor will direct your attention to the original articles of incorporation for Vanguard Capital Management, filed 19 years ago in the state of Delaware. You will note the sole incorporating officer, the sole shareholder, and the sole registered agent. Judge Harrison ran his finger down the page. He stopped. He looked up, peering over his glasses, straight at Clara. Clara met his gaze. She didn't blink. The tremor in her hand was completely gone. The heavy, numb feeling in her chest had been replaced by a slow, spreading warmth. It wasn't the fiery heat of vengeance. It was the quiet, absolute warmth of survival. "The sole shareholder," Judge Harrison read aloud, his voice echoing in the still room, "is Clara." "That's a lie," Richard shouted. He slammed his hands flat on the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Chloe let out a tiny shriek, dropping her phone onto the floor. "That is a forged document. I built this company. I am the CEO. Mr. Richard, control yourself, or I will have you removed," Judge Harrison barked, hitting his gavel once. It was a sharp cracking sound. "Sit down." Brent grabbed Richard's arm forcefully, pulling him back into the squeaking leather chair. "Your Honor," Brent said, his face now a mottled, terrifying shade of purple sweat beading on his upper lip. "Even if the wife's name is on the holding company paperwork, it was executed during the marriage. It is a marital asset subject to 50-50 equitable distribution. Turn to Exhibit C, Your Honor," Miriam said, calmly, completely unbothered by the shouting. "You will find a post-nuptial agreement signed by Mr. Richard 12 years ago when the company secured its first round of massive venture debt." Clara remembered that day vividly. Richard had been terrified. He had over-leveraged them on a bad real estate deal in Florida, hiding the debt from the corporate board. If the bank had called the loan, they would have lost everything. Clara had bailed him out. She liquidated her own private stock portfolio money she had earned independent of him and injected it into the company to cover his tracks. But she had made a demand. She drafted a document. She told him it was standard corporate restructuring to protect the assets from his personal creditors. He had signed it while eating a pastrami sandwich, not even bothering to wipe the mustard off his thumb before putting pen to paper. The post-nuptial agreement, Miriam explained to the court, explicitly states that in exchange for an emergency capital injection of $400,000 from Clara's sole and separate inheritance, Mr. Richard relinquished any and all community property claims to Vanguard Capital Management and its subsidiaries. He signed away his rights to the equity to save himself from bankruptcy. Richard stammered. The color was rapidly draining from his face, leaving him looking sickly gray and suddenly very old. The bespoke slate gray suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame now. He looked frantically at Brent. "Brent, do something. She tricked me. I didn't know what I was signing." "Ignorance of a contract you signed is not a legal defense, Mr. Richard," Judge Harrison said dryly. He turned the page in the binder. The rustle of the paper was deafening. "And it appears your signature was notarized. Twice." "Furthermore, Your Honor," Miriam said, driving the final cold nail into the coffin. "As the sole owner of Vanguard Capital, my client held an emergency board meeting yesterday evening." Richard's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. The smell of his expensive bergamot cologne suddenly seemed sour, tinged with the sharp metallic scent of nervous sweat. "What?" he breathed. "At that meeting," Miriam continued smoothly, "the board reviewed the financial ledgers of the subsidiary Horizon Global. We discovered a disturbing pattern of embezzlement, specifically corporate funds being diverted to a private LLC to pay for a luxury apartment lease, expensive dinners, and various gifts." Miriam paused, letting her eyes drift deliberately to Chloe. Chloe had stopped looking for her phone. She was sitting bolt upright, her hands clutching her small, expensive handbag in her lap. Her mouth was slightly open. She looked from Richard to the judge, the reality of the situation slowly penetrating the haze of her perfume and privilege. She wasn't sitting next to a billionaire. She was sitting next to an employee who was about to be unemployed. As a result of this gross financial misconduct, Miriam said, turning back to the judge, Vanguard Capital has terminated the CEO of Horizon Global effective immediately for cause. All severance packages are voided due to the breach of fiduciary duty. Clara watched Richard. She expected him to explode again. She expected him to yell, to throw something, to curse her name. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the polished wood of the table. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled out of the water, suffocating in the dry air. The realization was a physical weight pressing down on him, crushing the arrogant posture out of his spine. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was a middle-aged man who had just lost his job, his company, and his fortune, all before lunch. Clara felt a profound, crushing emptiness. She had won. She had protected herself. She had secured the empire she had built in the shadows. But looking at the man across the aisle, the man she had loved when they were broke and eating cold fries in a diner, the man she had covered for, lied for, and bled for, she didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired. "Your Honor," Miriam said, gently sensing the absolute devastation radiating from the plaintiff's table. "We have submitted a revised settlement offer for Mr. Richard. Exhibit G." Judge Harrison flipped to the back of the binder. He read it silently. A tiny grim smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Ms. Miriam," the judge said, his tone thick with irony, "this offer seems familiar." "Yes, Your Honor," Miriam replied. "My client is prepared to be generous. We will offer Mr. Richard the primary residence in full. The mortgage is fully paid, along with a lump sum of $2.5 million, paid out in quarterly installments over 5 years. Furthermore, my client will graciously assume all marital debt." It was his own insult, repackaged and handed back to him on a silver platter. Brent put his head in his hands. Chloe slowly, deliberately slid her chair an inch away from Richard. Clara picked up her water bottle. Her hand was perfectly steady. She took a sip. The water was lukewarm, tasting faintly of plastic, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. Wood cracked against the sounding block, a sharp, violent punctuation mark on 20 years of shared history. Judge Harrison didn't linger to witness the fallout. He swept his black robes around his shoulders, grabbed his ceramic coffee mug, and vanished through the heavy oak door behind his bench. The heavy click of the latch echoed, leaving behind a sudden vacuum of authority in courtroom 302. Instantly, that silence was filled by the chaotic wet sound of Richard breathing. Clara slowly unlaced her fingers from where they had been tightly gripped in her lap. Her joints ached, stiff and pale. She reached down, picked up her leather tote bag, and deliberately placed it on the table. The zipper made a loud, serrated tearing noise in the quiet room. She began sliding her legal pads inside, ensuring the edges didn't bend. It was a mundane task, but her hands were clumsy, heavy with the sudden crash of adrenaline leaving her bloodstream. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean down to the bone. Across the aisle, the disintegration was entirely physical. Richard was still seated, his large hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked like a man who had been dropped from a great height and was still waiting for his organs to catch up with gravity. His mouth was open, pulling in shallow, ragged breaths. Chloe moved first. The girl possessed the sheer, pragmatic survival instinct of a cornered animal. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't offer a comforting touch. She simply bent down her cream-colored silk dress, pulling tight across her thighs, and retrieved her fallen phone. The screen was cracked. She stared at the spider web of shattered glass for a fraction of a second, her face entirely devoid of emotion, before slipping it into her small designer handbag. She stood up. The sharp clack of her red-soled heels against the linoleum sounded like gunfire. "Chloe!" Richard croaked, his voice entirely stripped of its usual booming resonance. It was a thin, reedy sound. Chloe didn't pause. She didn't turn around. She walked straight down the center aisle, pushed through the heavy pneumatic double doors, and disappeared into the hallway. The smell of her jasmine and tuberose perfume lingered for a moment, sickly sweet, before the courthouse's industrial pine cleaner aggressively neutralized it. "Don't look at him," Miriam murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum next to Clara's ear. Miriam was calmly snapping the locks on her leather briefcase. "We are walking out of here. Keep your eyes on the exit. Do not engage." Clara nodded, a short, jerky movement. She slung her bag over her shoulder. The strap bit into her collarbone, a grounding physical pressure. She stepped out from behind the defense table. "Clara," the desperation in his voice was a physical weight forcing her to stop. She didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at her to keep walking, to push through the doors and breathe the polluted city air outside. But 20 years of conditioning is a difficult circuit to break. She turned her head. Richard had stumbled out from behind his table. Brent, his lawyer, was frantically stuffing papers into a box, aggressively avoiding eye contact with anyone clearly already calculating how to bill for this disaster. Richard looked awful. The bespoke slate gray suit, which had looked like armor an hour ago, now looked like a borrowed costume. Sweat had soaked through the collar of his expensive Egyptian cotton shirt. A vein throbbed erratically at his temple. Up close, Clara could see the burst blood vessels in the whites of his eyes and a patch of gray stubble on his jawline he had missed while shaving. He didn't look like a titan of industry. He looked like an old, terrified man. "You can't do this," Richard said, stepping toward her. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling. "Clara, please, 20 years. We built this together. You can't just take it all. It's my life." Clara looked at his outstretched hand. She remembered the shape of his fingers, the way the hair grew on his knuckles. She remembered those hands holding hers in hospital waiting rooms, gripping the steering wheel of their first rusty car, signing the lease on their first tiny apartment. The phantom pain of what they used to be flared in her chest, a sharp, twisting ache. But right beneath it was the cold, solid rock of reality. "I didn't take it, Richard," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it felt like she was speaking through a layer of thick cotton. "You gave it away, piece by piece, to the bank, to your ego, to her. I made a mistake." He yelled the sudden volume, making Miriam step smoothly between them, a physical barrier of navy wool and professional detachment. "It was just a stupid midlife crisis. I was stressed. The supply chain issues the board breathing down my neck. I just needed an escape. It meant nothing." Clara felt a bitter, ugly laugh clawing its way up her throat. She swallowed it down, tasting bile. "It meant $40,000 a month from the corporate accounts, Richard. You bought her a Porsche with the vendor retention fund. You didn't just break our marriage. You committed federal fraud." Richard recoiled as if she had slapped him. The redness drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. He looked at Miriam, then back to Clara, his mouth working silently. Mr. Richard. Miriam said, her tone dripping with absolute freezing courtesy. I strongly advise you to direct all future communication through your counsel. The settlement offer expires at 5 p.m. on Friday. After that, we revoke the lump sum and the house, and we proceed with civil litigation for the embezzled funds. Good day. Miriam placed a firm hand on the small of Clara's back, guiding her toward the exit. Clara let herself be moved. She walked down the aisle, her flat shoes making no sound against the floor. Pushing through the heavy wooden doors, the cacophony of the courthouse hallway hit them. Ringing phones, arguing couples, the squeak of a janitor's cart. Clara stopped by a drinking fountain. The metal was cold. She leaned against the tiled wall, pressing her forehead to the cool, porous surface. Her legs were shaking violently now, her knees threatening to buckle. She closed her eyes, pulling in a deep, shuddering breath that smelled of floor wax and old paper. You did perfectly, Miriam said, quietly, standing beside her, an imposing bodyguard. You didn't break. I feel like I'm going to throw up, Clara whispered, the cold sweat prickling her hairline. That's just the adrenaline leaving your system, Miriam replied, checking her watch. It's entirely normal. You survived the amputation. Now we just have to cauterize the wound. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom, blurring the gray skyline of the city into a watery, distorted smear. The drops hit the thick glass with a heavy rhythmic thrumming, vibrating through the soles of Clara's shoes. The air in the room was overly conditioned, smelling sharply of ozone from the massive server towers down the hall, cut with the bitter acidic tang of a neglected pot of dark roast coffee sitting on the credenza. Clara stood at the head of the massive mahogany table. She wasn't wearing a power suit. She was wearing a comfortable, oversized cashmere sweater and dark slacks, the clothes of a woman who intended to work, not perform. The wood beneath her fingertips was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the grim, exhausted lines around her eyes. It was Tuesday afternoon, exactly 5 hours since she had walked out of courtroom 302. Seated around the table were the 6 senior executives of Horizon Global. They were men and women in their 40s and 50s, draped in expensive tailoring, all staring at Clara with a mixture of profound shock, veiled hostility, and raw, undisguised panic. None of them truly knew her. To them, Clara was a myth, a vague entity referred to in hushed tones by the accounting department. She was Richard's quiet wife, the woman who occasionally showed up to the company Christmas party, drank a single glass of white wine, and left early. They had spent years worshiping at the altar of Richard's charismatic leadership, mistaking his volume for vision and his arrogance for competence. Now the ghost had walked into the machine, and she held the master key. I appreciate you all making the time on such short notice, Clara began. Her voice felt thin, lacking the booming acoustics Richard used to command this room. She cleared her throat, a dry, uncomfortable sound. She picked up a stack of manila folders from the table and began passing them down. The paper rasped against the wood. As you are now aware, Vanguard Capital Management has executed its right to terminate the CEO of this subsidiary. Effective immediately, I will be stepping in as the interim managing director. Silence hung over the table, thick and suffocating. A younger executive near the end, a man named Gregory, who ran logistics, swallowed audibly. The click in his throat sounded like a gunshot. David, the chief financial officer, shifted in his leather chair. The leather groaned a long, drawn-out squeak. David was a man who sweated profusely, his expensive silk tie currently loosened around a red, fleshy neck. He had been Richard's closest ally, his golfing partner, his drinking buddy. Clara, David said, forcing a condescending, strained smile. He placed his hands flat on the table. Listen, we are all deeply sorry about the personal issues between you and Richard, truly. But running a corporation of this magnitude with a global supply chain, it requires a delicate hand. The markets are going to panic when this news drops. Perhaps we should look at an internal promotion for the CEO role, someone familiar with the ground-level operations. Clara looked at him. She didn't glare. She just stared, letting the silence stretch out, letting the rain hit the glass. She watched a bead of sweat detach from David's hairline and roll slowly down his temple. A delicate hand, Clara repeated softly. The words tasted chalky. She opened the folder in front of her. David turned to page 4 of the packet I just handed you. David blinked his smile, faltering. He fumbled with the folder, his thick fingers struggling with the paper. He flipped to page 4. The other executives leaned in the rustle of clothing and breathing filling the quiet. That is a ledger printout from the third quarter vendor retention account. Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly flat, devoid of anger or accusation. It was just math, and math didn't care about feelings. You will notice a recurring disbursement of $12,000 routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, ultimately landing in an account held by Richard. David's face lost all color. The red flush vanished, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked exactly like Richard had looked in the courtroom. As CFO, Clara continued, her eyes locked onto his, you personally authorized every single one of those transfers. You bypassed the automated flagging system I built 12 years ago. You manually approved the diversion of corporate funds to cover up my husband's private expenses. He told me it was a classified R&D project. David stammered, his voice cracking. The smell of his nervous sweat, acrid and sharp, wafted across the table, cutting through the ozone and coffee. He was the CEO. I was following directives. You are a fiduciary, David, Clara said, feeling the familiar throbbing headache returning behind her left eye. It was exhausting. The sheer willful incompetence of these men was exhausting. Your duty is to the company, not the man. You failed. She closed her folder with a soft, final thud. Security is waiting by your office, Clara said, her tone devoid of malice. It was just a logistical fact. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Vanguard Capital is withholding your severance, pending a full forensic audit. If we find that you profited personally from this arrangement, we will forward the findings to the district attorney. David sat frozen for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the reality snapped his spine. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply stood up his chair, rolling back and hitting the credenza with a dull thud. He walked out of the room, his head bowed, looking incredibly small. The remaining 5 executives stared at the empty chair. The air in the room had dropped 10 degrees. The condescension was entirely gone, replaced by a stark primal fear. Clara wasn't the quiet wife anymore. She was the executioner. Now, Clara said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She picked up a pen, clicking it once. Gregory, the Asian shipping lanes are currently bottlenecked in Long Beach. Let's talk about rerouting the Q4 inventory. For a moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, with shaking hands, Gregory opened his laptop. The quiet clicking of keyboards began to fill the room, a hesitant, terrified symphony of survival. Clara sat down at the head of the table. The leather chair felt too big, too cold. She looked out the window at the rain. She had control. She had saved the empire. But as she listened to the rain and the nervous tapping of keys, she felt an overwhelming, crushing sense of isolation. The view from the top was just as lonely as the view from the bottom. Cardboard boxes smelled like dust-dry paper and the bitter tang of packing tape adhesive. Clara stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It was Wednesday morning. Outside, the sky was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a storm that refused to break. The air in the house was stagnant, thick with the smell of old wool carpets and the stale, sour scent of unspoken resentment. The house was absurdly large. 10,000 square feet of forced elegance, filled with things they had bought to prove they were successful, rather than things they actually liked. The ceilings were too high, causing every sound to echo with a hollow, lonely resonance. In the center of the room, Richard was packing. He was kneeling on the imported Persian rug, a rug that had cost more than Clara's first salary stuffing clothes into a massive leather suitcase. The sound of a heavy brass zipper teeth separating filled the room harsh and abrasive. He wasn't folding anything. He was just grabbing handfuls of expensive fabric cashmere sweaters, silk ties, tailored shirts, and shoving them in desperate to fill the void. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same slate gray trousers from the court hearing, but the shirt was rumpled untucked and stained with something dark near the collar. His silver hair, usually perfect, was greasy and sticking up in erratic clumps. Clara watched him. She didn't feel a triumphant surge of vindication. She didn't feel like a victorious general observing a defeated enemy. She just felt an immense, draining sadness. This was the man who used to make her laugh until her ribs ached in a damp, freezing apartment in Queens. This was the man who had held her hand while she miscarried their first and only pregnancy, weeping quietly into her hair. Now he was just a stranger, ruining expensive sweaters. "You don't have to watch me," Richard muttered, not looking up. His voice was ragged, scraped raw by shouting or crying, she couldn't tell which. He threw a dark blue tie into the suitcase. It pooled there, looking like a dead snake. "I'm not going to steal the silver, Clara." "I know you're not," Clara said softly. Her voice sounded too loud in the cavernous room. "I'm just waiting for the movers to arrive for the larger furniture." Richard stopped moving. He stayed kneeling on the floor, his hands resting on the edge of the leather suitcase. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Dust motes danced lazily in the gray light filtering through the massive windows. Slowly, he reached into the side pocket of his duffel bag and pulled out a framed photograph. The silver frame was slightly tarnished. He held it up. The glass was cracked straight down the middle. "Do you remember this?" he asked, his voice cracking thick with a sudden desperate emotion. Clara looked at it. It was a picture of them in Florence 15 years ago. They were sitting on a stone wall eating cheap gelato. Richard was looking at the camera, laughing, his face young and unburdened. Clara was looking at Richard, a soft, devoted smile on her face. The phantom pain flared again, sharper this time. It felt like a hot wire pulled tight across her chest. "I remember," Clara said. Her throat was incredibly dry. She swallowed the movement, painful. "It was raining that day. We hid in a church. We were happy." Richard pleaded, his eyes wide, bloodshot, begging her to feel the nostalgia, begging her to let the past rewrite the present. He pushed himself up off the floor, taking a step toward her. The floorboards groaned slightly beneath his weight. "Clara, look at us. We built a life. We built an empire. You can't just erase it because of a mistake." We can fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't do this. Don't throw me out like trash." He was crying now, real ugly tears tracking down through the stubble on his cheeks. He smelled like stale alcohol, sleep deprivation, and sheer terror. Clara stood her ground. She didn't step back, but she didn't reach out to comfort him either. She let him cry. She watched the tears fall onto the expensive silk of a shirt spilling out of the suitcase. "I'm not erasing it, Richard," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. The absolute truth of it tasted like ash in her mouth. "You erased it. You erased it every time you lied to my face. You erased it every time you signed a corporate check to pay for her apartment. You didn't just break a vow. You humiliated me. You made me complicit in a fraud. It was just sex," he yelled, a sudden desperate burst of anger cutting through the tears. He gestured wildly with his hands. "It meant nothing. She meant nothing." "That makes it worse," Clara said, the coldness returning, a necessary shield settling over her heart. "You risked everything we built. You risked my freedom for nothing, for a cliché." She stepped fully into the room, her shoes quiet on the thick rug. She stopped 3 feet away from him. "I loved you," Clara said. The words hung in the air, a definitive past tense eulogy. "I loved you enough to build the foundation you stood on. I loved you enough to stay in the shadows so you could shine. But I will not let you drag me down with you when you fall. I will not let you bankrupt the only thing I have left." Richard stared at her. The anger drained out of him, leaving only the hollow, pathetic shell. He looked down at the photograph in his hand. His thumb rubbed over the cracked glass, obscuring Clara's face. "You're cold," he whispered, a final weak accusation. "You were always so cold, even in the beginning. You just cared about the numbers, the spreadsheets." Clara felt a bitter smile touch the corners of her mouth. She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend the countless nights she had stayed awake, worrying about him, the silent sacrifices she had made. He wouldn't understand anyway. He only understood grand gestures and loud noises. "If I hadn't been cold," Clara replied, her voice perfectly steady, "we would have frozen to death a long time ago. Keep packing, Richard. The truck will be here in 20 minutes. She turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. As she walked down the long, echoing hallway, the only sound was the heavy tearing noise of the packing tape ripping off the roll, sealing a box, sealing a life. The fluorescent lights in the subterranean parking garage buzzed a persistent, grating electrical hum that drilled directly into the base of Clara's skull. Concrete grit ground beneath the thin soles of her flats as she walked toward her car. The air down here was heavy, stagnant, thick with the smell of exhaust damp concrete and the faint sweet scent of leaked antifreeze. It had been 4 weeks since the court hearing. 4 weeks since Richard had packed his bags and driven away in a leased sedan, leaving the keys to the Porsche on the kitchen counter. Clara fished her keys from the bottom of her leather tote bag. Her fingertips brushed against loose receipts, a spare tube of lipstick she hadn't worn in months, and the cold metal of a stray pen. The fob clicked. Across the dim expanse of the garage, the headlights of her practical mid-size sedan flashed twice, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the dead air. She opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cold. She closed the door, sealing herself inside the airtight quiet of the cabin. She didn't start the engine immediately. She just sat there, resting her forehead against the hard plastic of the steering wheel. The exhaustion was bone deep. It wasn't the frantic, panicked exhaustion of a crisis. It was the slow, grinding fatigue of a marathon runner who had crossed the finish line only to realize there was no crowd, no medal, just an empty field. Running Horizon Global was brutal. She had spent the last month untangling the chaotic, deeply flawed supply chains Richard had established on handshakes and golf courses. She had fired 3 more executives, navigated a minor revolt from the European distribution team, and spent 14 hours a day staring at spreadsheets until the numbers blurred into solid black lines. She turned the key. The engine purred to life, a steady, reliable vibration. The drive home was a blur of wet asphalt and glowing red taillights. The city looked beautiful in the dark, smeared with rain and neon, but Clara felt entirely disconnected from it. She was a ghost haunting her own life. She pulled into the sprawling driveway of the primary residence. The house sat entirely dark against the night sky. The security light snapped on as she approached, casting harsh geometric shadows across the manicured lawn. The front door unlocked with a heavy metallic clank. Clara stepped inside, dropping her keys into the silver bowl on the console table. The sound echoed through the massive foyer. The silence of the house was absolute. It was no longer the tense, suffocating silence of a failing marriage. It was just an empty, cavernous quiet. The movers had taken Richard's heavy leather armchairs, his ridiculous pool table, his massive television. The house felt hollow, a rib cage missing its heart. Clara walked into the kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed cold and sterile under the recessed lighting. She opened the massive stainless steel refrigerator. It was mostly empty. A carton of oat milk, some wilted spinach, a bottle of very expensive white wine she had no desire to open, and a block of salted butter. She wasn't hungry, but she knew she needed to eat. Her clothes were fitting loosely, hanging off her frame. She took out a slice of bread, dropped it into the toaster, and pushed the lever down. While she waited, she opened her briefcase. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents from Vanguard Capital. The final dissolution papers. The formal transfer of all remaining joint assets into her sole name. The toaster popped. The sudden noise made her flinch, her shoulders jumping toward her ears. Clara pulled the hot toast out, burning her fingertips slightly. She dropped it onto a paper plate. She didn't bother with a knife. She just scraped a cold, hard pat of salted butter over the surface, watching it melt into the toasted grains. She carried the paper plate and the documents to the massive dining room table. She sat down at the head of the table, the empty chairs stretching out before her in the dark room. She took a bite of the toast. It was dry, scratching the roof of her mouth. The butter tasted overwhelmingly salty, a sharp contrast to the dullness in her mouth. She picked up her fountain pen. The metal barrel was cold against her skin. She unscrewed the cap. She didn't feel like a victor. There was no triumphant montage, no swelling music, no sudden realization that she was a powerful, unstoppable force. She was just a tired, middle-aged woman eating dry toast in a house that was entirely too big for her. But as she smoothed her hand over the crisp, heavy paper of the contract, a subtle, profound shift occurred in her chest. She looked at the signature line. Clara, just Clara, sole owner, sole proprietor. She had lost a husband. She had lost 20 years of a shared illusion. She had lost the comforting lie that someone else was driving the car. But sitting in the cold, echoing dining room, tasting the salt on her tongue, she realized what she had gained. She was no longer the architect living in the basement. She owned the entire building. She owned the silence. She owned the exhaustion. It was heavy, and it was lonely, but for the first time in her life, it was entirely, indisputably hers. Clara pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. The scratch of the metal against the page was the only sound in the house, sharp, clear, and perfectly steady. She signed her name. If this story of betrayal, quiet strategy, and ultimate reclamation resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the loudest person in the room rarely holds the power. Subscribe to our channel for more raw, deeply human stories of people fighting back and rebuilding their lives. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible narratives to life.